This morning we are going to hear from Dr. Billy Collins. But first I'd like to share a story. I don't know if you've taken the train in New York City early in the morning when it's crowded and you have to wait 2 or 3 trains before you can actually get on one. And in that one, you're squished up against a pole with a lot of people behind you pressing against you. I'm not one to take the New York subway. I generally drive everywhere. So this one time I took the train. It was around last year this time. And I happened to be crushed up against this pole. And oftentimes when that happens and I'm on the train, I'll look for something to read. So I know that New York has poetry in motion. And so as I was standing there, I noticed a poem. I couldn't see who wrote it. So I started reading it, and as I read through it, my body, the tension in my body and the frustration I felt began to leave my body. And by the time I finished that poem, I felt my entire body smile. And I actually asked someone, could you move so I can see who wrote this? And at the bottom, it was Billy Collins. So I immediately sent him an email and I explained to him what happened to me, because 2 years ago, we had asked Billy Collins if he would come at our first conference, and he was already engaged. So he said, keep me in mind. I called him, told him, and he said, how could I say no? So we're very happy to have him today. Billy Collins was born in New York City in 1941. He is the author of several books of poetry, including Aimless Love, New and Selected Poems, published by Random House, Horoscopes for the Dead, Poems, Random House Again, Ballistics, Poems, 2008, She Was Just 17, 2006, The Trouble with Poetry, and many, many more books. If I stood here and read you all the books he's published, he wouldn't be able to speak because we'd run out of time. Poet Stephen Dunn has said about his poetry, we seem to always know where we are in a Billy Collins poem, but not necessarily where he is going. I love to arrive with him at his arrivals. He doesn't hide things from us, as I think lesser poets do. He allows us to overhear clearly what he himself has discovered. And I have to say, for my students who absolutely love Billy Collins' poetry, it is because it is accessible. And that's why they enjoy it so much. And it's so beautifully written. Included among the honors, Billy Collins has received our fellowships from New York Foundation for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Guggenheim Foundation. He has also been awarded the Oscar Blumenthal Prize, the Bess Hawkins Prize, the Frederick Bach Prize, and the Levinson Prize, all awarded by Poetry Magazine. In October of 2004, Collins was selected as the inaugural recipient of the Poetry Foundation's Mark Twain Prize for Humor and Poetry. In April 2013, Collins was selected as the 4th winner of the Donald Hale Jane Kenyon Prize in American Poetry. In June 2001, Billy Collins was appointed United States Poet Laureate from 2001 to 2003. In January 2004, he was named New York State Poet Laureate 2004 to 2006. Billy Collins is a distinguished professor of English at Lehman College of the University of New York. He is one of our own, as well as a senior distinguished fellow of the Winter Park Institute at Rollins College. We are introducing Billy Collins. I'm speaking, and then we will have one of our senior faculty in the English department at BARROW Manhattan Community College, who has other wonderful things to say about Billy, Robert ZWEIG.
I occasionally teach modern poetry. Sometimes I ask students to share some of their thoughts they have about poetry in the first day of class. Here are some recent questions they asked. Why doesn't the poet just say what he wants to say more clearly? Or sometimes it takes a form like, why does a poet talking so fancily? How do I find out what the poem really means? How do I know if my interpretation of a poem is correct? How much does the book cost? I can answer the last question with reasonable accuracy, but for the others, I employ several strategies. Sometimes comparing a paraphrase of a poem with the poem itself helps. Other times I read a poem and ask students to respond in any way they wish to. Sometimes I begin by reading a Billy Collins poem called Schoolsville. We enter the poem without too much difficulty and have a very rewarding experience trying to get out of it. I recently began a class by reading a Billy Collins poem called Introduction to Poetry, which I think was published in 1988, something like that. Introduction to Poetry. I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do to the poem is tie it to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. When I finish reading the poem, a student asked me, "What does this poem really mean?" The previously mentioned poem, Schoolsville, ends this way. A professor is lecturing the wallpaper, quizzing the chandelier, reprimanding the air. I often do this when I teach poetry. Please join me in welcoming Billy Collins.
Good morning. I only get 2 introductions. Thank you for both of them. And yeah, that's interesting that they would respond to that poem, which is an anti-interpretation poem, by wondering what it means. Something French about that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about teaching and about teaching, my experience in the classroom and teaching poetry, and my experience as a poet in composing poems. And I'm going to read a couple of poems, but not many. And I'd really like to hear questions from you about your classroom experience. I don't know, I find there are a couple of basic walls one runs into in teaching literature, especially poetry. And one is the wall of ambiguity. That comes up really early because students tend to thirst for one meaning, and bless their hearts. I mean, that's not an unreasonable expectation that something can mean one thing. However, someone defined poets as people who have a hard time saying one thing at a time. So I think when students start out with poetry, ambiguity, the state in which several meanings can be sustained in almost a complementary way and not a contradictory way, is frustrating. It later, I mean, once you become an English teacher, we realize that ambiguity deepens the texture of a poem. That ambiguity, ever since William Emerson wrote that book, 7 Types of Ambiguity, back in the 40s, I think, or 50s, ambiguity has been, valorized as a good thing. But that takes some maturation, and that's part of the problem with teaching young people anything. And the other thing, another wall I think we run into is, well, the wall rises usually 6 weeks into the semester in an introduction to literature course. Usually after reading a Flannery O'Connor story. And a hand goes up in the back of the room, and the student is emboldened to ask, are we going to read anything that's like happy or optimistic this semester? And you just have to say, the answer is no, we're not. We're not. Are every story going to be depressing? And yes. Yes, it is going to be depressing. Because the content of literature is misery leading to death. Right? Fiction is about misery, poetry is about death. But I think what you have to explain to them, because that's a rather crude way, but I like saying no to their expectations of happiness. I think what one has to say to them is that, yeah, the content of literature tends to be unhappiness and misery. But what we're leaving out there is the form of literature. The form of literature is happy. The form of literature gives pleasure. The content is sad, the form is happy. So just take the ending of King Lear, for example. You have a kind of emotional massacre where Shakespeare is actually pushing Lear a little beyond the kind of conventional boundaries of tragedy. And it's just into a state of pure pain without anesthesia. But we're having a great time with Shakespeare when we're reading Lear. I mean, it's divided into acts and scenes. The blank verse is chugging along there. We have these beautiful themes of blindness and ingratitude braided throughout. So it's a masterpiece. I mean, we love the form of it. It keeps giving us pleasure because we're symmetry-seeking and pleasure-seeking lovers of literature. And that's the tension of literature. The tension of literature is basically the unhappiness of the content and the joy of the form. And that's why literature is superior to television. Television is basically happy content, happy form, except for Breaking Bad. Anyway, those are two things I find myself addressing perennially: the misery question and the ambiguity question. I'd love to read a poem by a Canadian poet. When I became poet laureate, the thing I did was create this program called Poetry 180 that some of you may know about. It started as a website attached to the Library of Congress, and then my publisher thought it'd be a good idea to put it into a book, and then we did a book called Poetry 180. You can hold that up, and then we did another one called 180 More. And these are clear contemporary poems that students can kind of get on the first bounce. And it's part of my conviction that another pedagogical belief is that poetry should be taught chronologically backwards. I mean, when I was in school, which is some time ago, you would start with Chaucer. That's a terrible place to start, or Beowulf, worse, right? I mean, the idea, I think, with Poetry 180 is start them with clear contemporary poems that are plain spoken, that can lead them into areas of complexity, but not in the first lines. And then once you hook them on poetry, and you can through these anthologies, and I don't want to turn this into an infomercial, but I've gotten many reports particularly from high school teachers, that the most recalcitrant and resistant students often get hooked on a poem. Students who profess and to take a position, in fact, that they hate poetry, will hear a poem that they kind of like. That's kind of funny, or that's kind of interesting. And then that student has a cognitive problem. They don't like poetry, but they like that, and that's a poem. And then they figure that out. That's their problem. But then we can lead them backwards from contemporary poetry into poetry that's a little more distant, a little less plain spoken, a little less colloquial, a little less resonant with the colloquial ring of contemporary speech. But also, you can teach influence backwards. You're not sacrificing the whole idea of influence, because you can talk chronologically about how Whitman influences Allen Ginsberg, but you can talk about how Ginsberg influences Whitman. You can talk about how we read Whitman through the lenses of Ginsberg now. So it's like the Hudson River. It's convenient. The Hudson River flows in two directions, right? The Native Americans had a name for it, which I don't know, but it meant the river that flows in two directions. It's a tidal river, so influence, literary influence, can flow in two directions. You can teach it chronologically forwards or backwards. It has two gears. Anyway, here's an example. Not all those poems are about teaching at all, or about being in school. It would be hard to find a lot of poems about teaching, because even though most poets today have attached themselves to a university, they used to hang around cafes, now they hang around universities, and they get this slow kind of morphine drip of a salary, which is, convenience. But very few poets talk about teaching. It's like they don't want to, it's as if they've transcended employment, right? But I think teaching is just as good a subject as anything. But here's a poem by a Canadian poet, Tom Wayman. And I think this will speak to your teaching hearts. And the title of the poem is a question that students should never, ever ask a teacher. And the title and the question is, did I miss anything? And as you know, the question is so insulting and insensitive and unanswerable, short of repeating the entire class for this absentee's benefit, that Tom Wayman gives a number of false, I would say smart-ass answers before he, at the end of the poem, delivers what I take to be his true teacher's answer. Did I miss anything? Nothing. When we realized you weren't here, we sat with our hands folded on our desks in silence for the full 2 hours. Everything. I gave a quiz, I gave an exam worth 40% of the grade for the term and assigned some reading due today, on which I'm about to hand out a quiz worth 60%. Nothing. None of the content of this course has value or meaning. Take as many days off as you like. Any activities we undertake as a class, I assure you, will not matter either to you or me and are without purpose. Everything. A few minutes after we began last time, a shaft of light suddenly descended, and an angel or other heavenly being appeared and revealed to us what each woman or man must do to attain divine wisdom in this life and the hereafter. This is the last time the class will meet before we disperse to bring this good news to all the people of earth. Nothing. When you are not present, how could something significant occur? Everything. Contained in this classroom is a microcosm of human experience, assembled for you to query and examine and ponder. This is not the only place such an opportunity has been gathered, but it was one place, and you weren't here. So he speaks finally from the heart, but he has to slap this kid around a little bit with these radical answers. Let me just talk a little bit about the teaching of poetry. I had a kind of conversion at somewhere along my career in teaching poetry, because I realized that what I was doing in the classroom had nothing to do with what I was doing when I wrote poems. There was a complete disconnect or disjuncture between my compositional experience and my pedagogical experience. And to put it simply, the kinds of questions that would come up in the classroom, questions about identifying a theme or tracking, kind of wrestling a symbol to the ground and making sense out of basically interpretation, explication, squeezing meaning out of the poem. These were the kinds of concerns that never crossed my mind when I wrote poems. I never thought when I was writing a poem, what's the theme here? I mean, that would be, I just stopped writing. It would be, I'd have to shake my head and get rid of that. Because basically, I think what's on a poet's mind is something much simpler than the theme of the search for the Father, or the theme of the return of nature, or the renewal of the earth, or whatever. What poets are really concerned about when they're writing is, how do I get out of this thing? How do I end it? And you quoted nicely from Stephen Dunn's generous comment when he talked about the ending of the poem is an arrival, right? It's not the ending of the poem to the poet. It's an arrival of a journey that the poem has been taking. And that's what I'm thinking about when I'm writing the poem. I'm pushing the poem forward. I'm trying to slip into various dimensions. I'm trying to listen to the poem to see where it's going. But finally, I'm on some kind of a little imaginative or verbal journey that I'm hoping will end at some point. In other words, I'll come to a point where I don't want to say any more and you don't want to hear any more. So there we have a mutually agreed upon place to stop. By the way, when I'm teaching writing workshops, I often tell students, where do you think your poem ends? You think it ends with the last lines you wrote? And then they think they know what I'm going to say next. They think I'm going to say it actually ends a stanza above that. That's a better ending. But I don't say that. I tell them that your poem doesn't end with the last lines. Your poem ends where the reader stops reading. Well, this gives them a whole different sense. You mean the sense that people bail, the reader bails out, especially with poems, because there's always another one. Just flip the page. When I put the Poetry 180 anthology together, just to take one example, I had to find 180 clear, interesting contemporary poems, which involved reading about 60,000 poems, about 50,000 of which I never finished reading. I mean, everyone has their deal breakers, right, that makes you stop reading. And sometimes they're very indefensibly idiosyncratic. For example, for me, the mention of dad or grandma, I'm done. I'm out. I'm out. I'm on the next page. And it's based on my sense that I think if you're writing about your grandma and your dad, you should write a memoir or a short story. If you read all of my poems, you'll find there are very few people in there. There are my parents. Well, I had them. I mean, that's not much of an autobiographical, a secret. And if it's a love poem, there's someone on the receiving end of the love. But otherwise, it's a rather unpopulated universe except for me and the reader. And I feel that the fewer people you have in your poems, the more alone you are with the reader. And I want to be completely alone with the reader. Cicada, I stop. I don't know why, but that's completely indefensible. I see the word cicada, I'm gone. But to get back to my point, I tried to then think about how can I bring into harmony my compositional experience with my classroom experience. And I decided I would try to treat the poem as I kind of saw it as I wrote it. And that really meant not asking, what does the poem mean? And John Ciardi, years ago, wrote a book called How Does a Poem Mean?, which is a movement in this direction. How does a poem mean? How does it go about meaning? But my question would be, how does a poem go? How does a poem move? How does a poem get through itself? And you can call this mapping the poem. In other words, a good example, and I had a copy here, but a good example is Dover Beach, a great example, because basically if you just compare the beginning of a poem to the ending, and then ask the question, how did he or she get there? So, you know how the poem starts. The sea is calm tonight, the tide is full, the moon lies fair upon the strait. It's this very calm, serene visual scene of the seacoast there. Well, I've got the poem right here. It fits on one page, and it can't be more than 30 lines long. But 30 lines later, we're on a darkling plain somewhere, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight where ignorant armies clash by night. Well, how did we get there? How did we get from this calm scene to this dystopian nightmare of armies fighting in the dark and not even knowing what they're fighting about? Well, I can show you, and you can show your students. It's easy, because there are shift points in the poem. There are maneuvers that take place in the poem as it develops through itself. One is when he says only, that is to say, but he hears from the spray. He says, listen, and you hear the roar of this melancholy roar. So suddenly the poem becomes an oral poem. We're listening to the surf. It's nighttime. The moon lies fair upon the strait, but it's still nighttime. And then he mentions in the next stanza, I won't go through the whole thing, but he mentions Sophocles. Well, there's a huge shift point, because we're wrenched out of the present into the classical past, right? This allusion brings us, kind of gathers all of history in, because what he's saying is Sophocles heard the same sound, right? And when you're standing at like the oceans, by the ocean's roar, you can think, well, Joan of Arc heard this, or John Milton heard this. It's the same sound. So it's a connective oral linkage there. Well, I won't go through the whole thing, but at one point he begins the next stanza with the allegory of the sea of faith. But you can show how Matthew Arnold got through the poem, and that makes the poem a little more alive in the classroom, because frankly, students think, Robert here, who gave me this kind introduction, is the co-editor of this, one of the rather famous anthologies or introductions to literature. A lot of students think that poems come from anthologies. They really don't think that people wrote them. They think Robert is the source of all literature, people like him. He's not. But if you make it clear, if you have them cover up the page and say, okay, so Matthew Arnold has written like the first 10 lines of this poem, and he really hasn't written the 11th line. So let's go back in history to that moment where he doesn't know what the 11th line is. And then you can see the poet as someone not delivering great truth, but figuring out how to get through this poem, how to work his way through the poem, through a set of shift points, maneuvers, however you want to phrase it. But that's sort of mapping out the poem. And it reveals that the poem has a kind of hydraulic to it, that it's a more of a living creature. And I think for me, it became an agreeable alternative in a way, or complement to sort of figuring out the poem. Robert Frost apparently was giving a reading once, and someone asked him from the audience, could you explain that poem a little bit? And he said, oh, you want me to say it worse, right? I just said it the best way it can possibly be said. Let me read, even though Robert gave away the ending of this poem, let me read, this is a poem about teaching for a long time. And it was written some time ago, but a friend and I were sitting around, a colleague and I, and one of us said, I wonder what it would look like if all the students we had ever taught were assembled in one place, gathered, yeah. I know, that's what we thought. I envisioned an angry mob, with torches and pitchforks, who are blaming me for all this misinformation they were carrying around for the rest of their lives. So we thought, well, would they fill a baseball stadium, or if you line them up, would they stretch from here to New Haven, or stuff like that? So the poem called Schoolsville is a way I found of configuring all these students. And there's a few, there's the word blackboard in here, which will probably need a gloss at some point. And chalk, what's chalk? The chalk years. Anyway, Schoolsville, glancing over my shoulder at the past, I realized the number of students I have taught is enough to populate a small town. I can see it nestled in a paper landscape, chalk dust flurrying down in winter, nights dark as a blackboard. The population ages, but never graduates. On hot afternoons, they sweat the final in the park. And when it's cold, they shiver around stoves, reading disorganized essays out loud. A bell rings on the hour, and everybody zigzags into the streets with their books. I forgot all their last names first and their first names last in alphabetical order. But the boy who always had his hand up is an alderman and owns the haberdashery. The girl who signed her papers in lipstick leans against the drugstore, smoking, brushing her hair like a machine. Their grades are sewn into their clothes like references to Hawthorne. The A's stroll along with other A's. The D's honk whenever they pass another D. All the creative writing students recline on the courthouse lawn and play the lute. Wherever they go, they form a big circle. Needless to say, I am the mayor. I live in the white colonial at Maple and Main. I rarely leave the house. The car deflates in the driveway. Vines twirl around the porch swing. Once in a while, a student knocks on the door with a term paper 15 years late, or a question about Yeats or double spacing. And sometimes one will appear in a window pane to watch me, lecturing the wallpaper, quizzing the chandelier, reprimanding the air. So that's someone who has taught too long, perhaps. I do want to hear some questions, but there's I wrote an article some time ago, and I was going to refer to it a little bit. The article is called Poetry, Pleasure, and the Hedonist Reader, and in it I come up with, I think, 6 or 7 kinds of pleasure that poetry delivers. It's like Cosmo. You have to have a number on the cover. You know, it's like 10 things that'll make them call back and stuff like that. So the last pleasure is the pleasure of meaning, because interpretation is a pleasure for me. I mean, I went to graduate school. I went to school until I couldn't go to school anymore. They give you a PhD and they tell you you have to leave now. Otherwise, I'd still be there. So clearly, I have a taste for difficult text. If I showed you my collected Wallace Stevens or my Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, you would see it. So they're all filled with dutiful marginal comments. So that's a pleasure. If it weren't a pleasure, I wouldn't have stayed in graduate school. But there are many other pleasures that poetry offers, and the trouble with them is that they're less teachable. You know, they don't require the intervention of the teacher, the mediation of the teacher. And I'll just run through a few of those pleasures, and then we can have some questions. Well, the first one was what I call the pleasure of the dance, which is just the pleasure of the rhythms of poetry, and how when you enter a poem, when you hear a poem like "It was many a year ago in the kingdom by the sea that a maiden there lived whom you know by the name of Annabel Lee," you can get students, if you pick poems like that are very rhythmic and traditional, have a student read that, and then have a student read just a brief paragraph of prose, preferably something really deadly. And then go back and forth. Go back and forth from a little bit of poetry and a little bit of prose, and they'll start to hear the difference. they'll start to feel the dance of the difference. When Kenneth Koch was asked, what's the difference between prose and poetry, he taught by example, and he said, here is prose. No dogs allowed on the beach. Prose. This is poetry. No dogs or logs allowed on the beach. No poodle, however trim. No dachshund unable to swim. So, why is that poetry? Well, the main thing is the words seem to be enjoying themselves. The words seem to be enjoying the company of the words around them, the way they don't in prose. Because in prose, they're part of the linear forward rush of information, right? And the way anyone identifies a poem from at 20 paces, I don't care if it's the poet laureate or a 6-year-old, we identify it the same way. The words don't go out to the end of the page, right? We see that there's space around the poem, and that's a poem. That's what we call a poem. Henry Taylor, I think, has the only unassailably true definition of poetry when he says that all verse and most poetry is an arrangement of lines whose length is determined by some principle other than the width of the page. Right? Poetry is an arrangement of lines whose length is determined by some principle other than the width of the page. So prose, you go out to the end of the page, you just fill the, prose is like water, it'll take the shape of any vessel you pour it into. Poetry is like sculpture, it needs to be, it has a shape to it. Poetry is a displacement of silence. I mean, the white space around the poem, to me, represents, it's a visual representation of silence. So a poem displaces silence, whereas prose is just a continuation of noise. Well, this is from a poet's point of view, of course. Or, as I like to say it, poetry is a bird, prose is a potato. That's just another objective way of looking at the differences between the two genres. Christopher Ricks gives another less funny example, but he says, prose, you could say, the silence of the green fields. You can find that in a novel somewhere. The silence of the green fields. Poetry, you can say, the green silence of the fields. In poetry, silence can have color, which indicates that there's a more imaginative leeway in poetry, which there is. Poetry really offers the highest degree of imaginative freedom. It's another reason why I stop reading when I get to Dad, because that shows a failure of imaginative possibilities. Do you ever come across the question from your students, like why don't some poems have rhyme and meter? Do they, or is that a concern of theirs at some point? Yeah. Why don't a lot of poems have rhyme and meter? Do they feel that rhyme and meter? Do they miss rhyme and meter? I mean, you find that more with kind of an older generation of people who've just lost touch with poetry, like they don't keep up with the latest dances either. Well, why should they? I gave a talk last year at a Kiwanis club, a little like a pro bono talk for the community, and this guy came up afterward. I think he must have been in his 80s, and he said, "What about rap music? Do you think rap music is kind of poetry?" And I gave him a kind of answer about it's a place where rhyme went and that kind of thing. And then as we were breaking off, I said, "Do you actually listen to a lot of rap music?" And he said, "Well, I hear it mostly at intersections." All right. The thing, because the main thing about, I'm going to open it to questions, but one last. Well, I could just flip through this. I had like the pleasure of rhythm, the pleasure of the page. I talked about a little bit about the space on the page. The way a poem, even though there's no metrical reason for turning back at a certain point, like whose woods these are, I think I know, you turn back, his house is in the village though, you turn back. even though there's no metrical reason, we turn back because at least we're trying to avoid writing prose. I mean, so poets are like a prose avoidance systems, you know. But in turning back, what we're doing also is turning the attention of the reader back into the poem, recirculating and redirecting the attention of the reader. So the lines ending before the end of the page are calling out to the reader, come back inside the body of the poem. Because there is a body in this poem, there is a field of verbal play, and there's an enjoyment going on in that these words are enjoying each other's company, as I said. So it's turning our attention back. We're not rushing forward to some plot conclusion, because we don't care if Edwina marries Charles, right? This is not a novel. Those are not the satisfactions of poetry. The satisfaction is being turned back into a field of verbal play. So there was the pleasure of sound, the pleasure of metaphoric connection, the pleasure of travel, the pleasure of, by travel I mean imaginative travel, right? The pleasure of going someplace you haven't been before. I like poems that begin in Kansas and end in Oz. And one reason I stop reading poems is I stop reading poems that begin in Oz. I don't know how you got to Oz, but you didn't take me with you. So if a poem starts out being too wiggy, and there are, flamingos playing croquet in the first line or whatever, I'm out. I mean, I'm glad you're having a great time with the toy of your brain. But I want to end up in Oz. I want to end up in an odd, potentially disorienting place, but I don't want to start out there. And I think it's like in the Matthew Arnold poem, start simple and complex. Start the moon lies fair upon the strait. Just start with the scene. It's a seductive technique. Get the reader in. Then once the reader's in, and once you throw in some Sophocles and the Sea of Faith and a love interest, then you can throw into the reader's face this horrible scene of ignorant armies clashing by night on a darkling plain. But you have to you can't start with ignorant armies clashing by night on a darkling plain. You have to bring the reader into it step by step. Anyway, there's that beautiful place in the Ode on a Grecian Urn but I can't go into that, I don't think. Where, he says by what, he sees the little procession, and then he wonders, what little town have they come from? Where did these people come from? What little town is emptied of its folk, this pious morn? Well, there's no pious morn. It doesn't exist. It's just a statue. And little town, thy streets. Now he starts talking to the town, which isn't even on the urn. And little town, thy streets forevermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate can e'er return. It's so sad, this town forever emptied of these people. But the question is, where are we? Keats, 3, 2, 1, come back. I mean, he's drifted into this beautifully hypothetical, imaginary town. It's like kind of wondering, where the people in the Hopper painting Nighthawks, what's going to happen when they go back to their apartments, or what's in their apartments now, I mean, it's just taking us to a very hypothetical, imaginary place. And that is under the heading of sort of imaginative travel. Okay, there's metaphoric connection, and there is the pleasure of meaning, and the pleasure of memorization. So on like that, anyways. But let me, I could go on. I mean, I'm a professor, I can talk for 50 minutes in the middle of the night, but do you have compared to your non-teaching friends, do you have kind of an unerring knowledge of what time it always is? I do. I can tell you almost to the minute what time it is. And I think it's because of all those 50-minute classes, because we're very aware of this this unit of 50 minutes. And I think we just carry that around as a kind of, it's too bad you can't quit teaching and just make money guessing what time it is, you know? But how about some questions about or comments about your experience in the classroom, problems you run into, or... yeah.
I had a question more about your own process. You said that the ending of the poem is an arrival, and I guess I was curious for you when you're writing. Do you have a sense of where you want to arrive, or where you're going to arrive, or is it a surprise to you when you get there, or does it vary?
Yeah, it's usually do I know the ending? Is kind of the simplification of the question. Almost all cases, no inkling whatsoever. And that's why, that's really the main reason to write for me, is wondering where this thing is going, and then having some degree of surprise. You know, sometimes it's really a kind of startling surprise. I mean, I have this poem called "The Trouble with Poetry," and it's really about just the trouble with poetry is that there's too much poetry, is sort of the wise guy point of the poem. And I say that, you know, where will it ever end? You know, where will poetry end unless finally we compare everything in the world to everything else in the world, and there's nothing left to do then? And I go on like that, and then suddenly I throw in this image that I took from Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and then I admit to it. I said I stole this from Lawrence Ferlinghetti. And then I realized that Lawrence Ferlinghetti is the ending of the poem. And I said, the bicycling poet of San Francisco, whose little amusement park of a book, Coney Island of the Mind, I used to carry in a side pocket of my uniform up and down the treacherous halls of high school. So I ended with me reading Ferlinghetti in high school. No idea I was going to get there. Those are very satisfying surprises. So usually there's a little surprise. And if I knew the ending, I don't think there's any poem I wrote where I really knew the ending. I mean, that would be backfilling. You know, it wouldn't be an imaginative journey if you knew the ending or the arrival already.
Do you always know when you've arrived?
I know when I'm arrived, yeah, because it's because I'm looking for an arrival. I mean, all of the poems, I don't think I would continue writing any of these poems if they didn't have a sense of momentum. Many poems I start and they show no willingness to go forward or to continue, and then I just abandon them. But the poems I stick with have a forward roll. You know, they're going somewhere. They don't know where they're going, but there's momentum there. And if there's momentum, then the more momentum, the easier it is to recognize the point of arrival, I think. And some poems are just like watercolors; they're not really going anywhere, and that's of no interest to me. Wisława Szymborska, the Polish poet, she's a great poet of imaginative surprise at the end of her poems. Yeah. Yeah. On grading creative writing, I just tell them in the beginning, you get an A if you do everything I tell you to do. Yeah, I mean, and then I start telling them to do really hard stuff. But no, it's usually, if you come to class, you turn in stuff, you exhibit some interest in, you give signs of interest. If you do all that, you get an A. I can't really grade the writing. I can grade their performance as students, which would be attending, showing up on time, doing exercises, stuff like that. And if you don't do that, you'll get less than an A. Yeah. Here's one over here, sir, and then you. Yeah.
I was interested in when you offered a lot of really interesting divisions between poetry and prose, and a lot of ways of accessing that. How would you apply these same dichotomies to the prose poem?
Oh, the prose poem. I'm not a great fan of the prose poem. I know that you indulge in that, but I feel it. I mean, some people do it really well. Russell Edson and other people. Some people are very famous for the prose poem. I think in a lot of cases it's an opportunity to write prose and poetry badly, you know. But I think once you give up the line is critical to me. I think that's what that's the distinguishing mark. I think you can give up pretty much every conventional definition or expectation, but once you give up the line, then I don't know where we are anymore, because I think poets are line-making creatures. You know, we're like Homo linearium or something. We're people who make lines, and also that sense of, you know, Charles Olson, the poet, said, "No line must sleep. No line must sleep. Every line needs to be alert, aware of, conscious of where it is in the poem, and making some kind of contribution, whether the contribution is rhythmic or metaphoric or conceptual or whatever, but every line needs to be contributing. And every line needs to, and when I'm writing, I am writing one line at a time, and I'm kind of standing on the line to make sure it's a decent line. So it's so integral to my writing that I get lost when I think of the other. Sir, you had one back there?
I'm just curious, what would you say to those who wrote, use the mic with people on this side. What would you say to those who wrote the Common Core standards and who recommend that 50% in middle school and 75% in high school text be informational or nonfiction?
Can I use a bad word? Well, it's discouraging. I mean, I know, you know, you people are the salt of the earth, really. I mean, there's so much you have to contend with, beginning with students, but you know, these imposed rules and restrictions by boards of education and all the testing and expectations, it's very hard to kind of find a way for play, really. I mean, that's such an element in teaching is playfulness, and not play in a kind of sandbox sense of the word, but play in a loosening, a kind of teaching that opens up imaginative possibilities and appeals to imaginative play. So I'm against it. And you had a question in back there? Yeah.
Related to the question about grading, what do you do in a workshop when a student turns in a draft and then doesn't want to revise at all? Like, my first draft is perfect.
Oh, right. Well, they think their first draft is perfect because they wrote it. Yeah, right. Well, that means that you haven't done enough to convince them that nobody cares about what they write. Now, you have to, you know, if they're basing, bless their hearts, but they're basing most of their writing on their individual thoughts and feelings. And you have to convince them that nobody cares about that. Because what we're interested in doing as writers is, we're interested in, as Roger Angell put it once, writing is all about the love of strangers. The love of strangers. It's not that you want some guy in a bookstore in Minneapolis to pick up your book and fall in love with it, right? And so that in their poems, they have to, in every poem they write, you're talking about poetry mostly? Yeah. In every poem they write, they have to tell a lie. It's a harmless lie. It's a little white lie. But the poem has to give off this lie. And the lie is that you care more about poetry than you love yourself. That's not true, right? But a reader does not go to read poetry because the reader is interested in the poet. I mean, unless you're writing a biography of somebody. You open a book of poems because you love poetry. You know, you don't love the poet. You don't care if the poet went on a canoe trip with her uncle or something. Who cares? I mean, looking through a stranger's family album is a form of insanity. I mean, why would you be interested that's my Uncle Charlie with the hat on? Who cares? right? So you have to get the reader to care, you have to put something into your poem that shows you love poetry. And that could be symmetry, it could be, well, it's just form. It's form. You have to teach them form. Form is seductive. No one cares about your thoughts and feelings. It would be insane to care about the thoughts and feelings of a stranger. No one cares about your internal life. People read poetry because they want to get poetry kicks. They want to get poetry thrills, and they get that through form. That's why we read poetry, for form. And so unless they're producing a poem that's formally interesting, or at least has signs of human intelligence, you know, that there's a designer, the hand of the designer is visible in the poem, it's just ephemera. It's just going to blow away. So revising means adding form or tightening the form. Revising does not mean being more honest about your feelings, because you're already honest about your feelings. That's what you have going for you. But you know, Oscar Wilde said, and you have to be careful with this quote, he said, all bad poetry is based on genuine feeling. He didn't mean that if a poem is based on genuine feeling, it's bad. He just meant if you took all bad poetry, you'll find that it's all based on genuine feeling. If I could draw a Venn diagram, you'd see that there's an overlap there. And Kay Ryan, wonderful poet, former poet laureate, said, you know, personal feeling in a poem is basically dead weight. You know? Why? Because autobiographical feeling, autobiographical misery, is completely claustrophobic. You know, it's not allowing for imaginative flight, you know? And it really didn't exist in poetry until the Romantic poets, you know, who killed I mean, in 1798, Wordsworth and Coleridge decided here's what we're going to do. We're going to get rid of sex and humor, and we're going to substitute landscape, right? This sucks, really, but it worked. You know, sex came back gradually, but humor didn't come back into poetry as a legitimate tone until, you know, 150 years later, probably, around the time of Philip Larkin. Other poets who demonstrated that you could be funny without being silly. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to share an anecdote. I teach what is called remedial reading, okay?
Okay.
And they are fancy.
That's redundant, yeah.
And called it academic and critical reading. But at any rate, I open my class every time with a poem. And we have a poem every time we open class. And we just see what happens. One day I used a poem and one girl broke out, "That is the most uncool poem I have ever heard." And I thought, well, good, someone's responding. And
Yeah.
so I said, well, were there some that you did like? And very interestingly, lots of students then began to talk about poems that we had read, that we had done, that they enjoyed. But up to that point, I hadn't really known how they were responding.
Huh.
I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that would be a good question. Like, how cool do you think this poem is? Maybe that would open up a discussion. I had a student who came up after our class, introduction to poetry class, and said something both stupid and profound. She said, you know, Professor, poetry is harder than writing, which I found very insightful, though contradictory in some basic way. How much time do we have? Or there's I'm sorry, question there.
Hi, I've been taking over teaching the wasteland to my honor students at community college, and I put them in groups, and that works pretty well. I teach, like, each group takes a part, but then I showed them the latest ZWEIG film, and he's standing in front of a trash can and talking about capitalism and waste, and, you know, it didn't work well. So my question is, do you relate poems to contemporary society? How do you do it? And it's also kind of a question about apologetics. How do you convince the students and the administration of the value of poetry, like for today, for their lives, for contemporary society?
Yeah, it's a huge question. I hate being on the defensive with poetry, but I think the main argument for poetry for me is that it's the only history that we have of human emotion. You know, we have lots of histories that involve treaties and wars and trade agreements and assassinations and beheadings and the growth of the middle class. That's always a surefire answer to what's going on in history. But we only have one history of the human heart, and that is poetry. And that's generally why, and we're very close to the site of 9/11 here, and that's generally why after 9/11, I was named Poet Laureate months before it happened. That's why people said, we're in a state of national trauma. Let's all go to the ballet. No, they didn't say that. They didn't say, let's go to a museum and look at some post-impressionist paintings. No, they said, we need a poem. We need a poem for this. We need a poem as a stabilizer. Not just an emotional stabilizer, but a poem that reminds us that we're not alone, right? There have been other traumas like this in history. Not exactly like this, but so it's that sort of, maybe I'd go so far to say a kind of healing element in poetry, but it reminds us that we're part of a continuity of human feeling. And if that doesn't convince them, they're just brickheads, I don't know. Yeah.
It sounds as though you don't believe that novels or memoirs are part of the history of the human heart.
Yeah.
So I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Well, they're just, that's a very good point. It's just that it's a shallow history. I mean, in terms of, shallow in terms of time. I mean, the novel is, it's only, like Defoe is like 1710, right? But Catullus is 30 BC or whatever. The novel is prose fiction is relatively a latecomer. And also, I would say, poetry addresses a human feeling in a more direct way, because it's not tied up with the bourgeois concerns of the novel. I mean, the novel is all wrapped up with the bourgeois concerns, particularly marriage. Like who's going to marry who, or who's going to fall in love with who, and will they have the baby, and what's going to happen to the baby? Well, I mean, that's fine, and there are feelings at play there, but the feelings are wrapped up in a plot drama that is leading to some conclusion. Whereas a poem is an unveiling, like a 2 or 3 minute unveiling of an emotion. And I just think the compression of poetry, the fact that it's not splayed over 350 pages, the fact that it's right there in your face, that it's memorizable and rereadable instantly, I think that gives it a power over prose. But I'm just resentful because my poems are not being made into movies the way novelists are. Thank you very much.